Throughout history, the idea of superpowers has belonged to fiction: flight, invisibility, super strength. But beyond cinema and mythology, there are documented human abilities that defy easy scientific explanation. Not magic, not fantasy, but measurable phenomena observed under controlled conditions. There are individuals who can withstand extreme cold without hypothermia. Others who possess memory capacities so vast they can recall decades of daily life in precise detail. Some can consciously control biological systems we are taught are automatic: heart rate, immune response, even pain perception. In laboratories, researchers have recorded unusual neurological patterns, metabolic responses, and cognitive anomalies that challenge conventional understanding of human limits. These cases are rare, but they are real. Modern neuroscience, physiology, and psychology offer partial explanations: stress adaptation, neuroplasticity, genetic variation. But in several cases, the mechanisms remain incomplete. The data exists, the replication does not. Tonight, we examine 8 real human abilities that stretch the boundary between biology and the unknown, abilities documented by science, yet not fully understood by it. For centuries, humanity has tried to define its own limits. We measure strength in numbers, intelligence in scores, endurance in seconds and miles. But occasionally, individuals emerge who operate beyond expected thresholds, without technology, without enhancement, without artificial assistance. This documentary explores 8 documented human abilities that researchers continue to study. These are not internet myths or sensationalized claims. They are cases investigated in medical journals, neuroscience labs, and controlled experiments. In each example, the phenomenon is measurable. What remains uncertain is the full mechanism behind it. The goal here is not to exaggerate, it is to observe, to examine where current scientific models explain part of the phenomenon, but not all of it, where biology stretches, adapts, and sometimes behaves in ways that remain only partially understood. If you appreciate documentary-style explorations that examine the edge of science without crossing into speculation, consider subscribing. A like supports deeper research-based content. And in the comments, share where you're watching from, your country, and your city. Curiosity is global. It's worth seeing how far it travels. Let's begin with the human body under extreme environmental stress. Technology 1, if it can be called that, is the human ability to endure extreme cold beyond what medical science predicts. Exposure to freezing temperatures typically leads to hypothermia. The body loses heat faster than it can produce it. Core temperature drops. Organs begin to fail. And yet, documented cases exist of individuals who can remain immersed in ice water for extended periods without suffering physiological collapse. One of the most studied examples involves voluntary exposure to sub-zero environments while maintaining stable core temperature and cardiovascular control. Laboratory measurements have shown unusual activation of brown adipose tissue, fat specialized in heat production. In addition, researchers observed controlled breathing patterns that influence autonomic nervous system response. Under typical conditions, cold shock triggers panic and hyperventilation. In these individuals, the stress response appears modulated. Brain scans suggest altered connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and deeper autonomic centers. Science can describe parts of the mechanism: metabolic heat generation, breath control, stress conditioning. But the degree of control, conscious override of reflexive survival responses, remains only partially explained. The second documented superpower is known as hyperthymesia, also called highly superior autobiographical memory. Individuals with this condition can recall specific days of their lives with extraordinary precision. Ask them what happened on a random date, 10, 20, even 30 years ago, and they can often describe the weather, the conversation they had, what they were wearing, and what news events occurred that day. This is not photographic memory in the traditional sense. It does not apply to random data, equations, or textbook content. It is autobiographical, deeply personal, and chronologically structured. Neurological imaging studies reveal structural differences in areas associated with memory processing, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus. Researchers have also identified increased connectivity between emotional processing centers and long-term memory storage regions. In most people, memory is selective. It compresses, it forgets, it filters. This is considered adaptive, necessary to prevent cognitive overload. In hyperthymesia, that filtering mechanism appears reduced. The brain retains daily experiences with unusual persistence. Yet science still struggles to determine why only a handful of individuals develop this ability. Is it purely structural, genetic, developmental, or is it a byproduct of obsessive memory rehearsal early in life? The phenomenon is measurable. Brain scans confirm differences. But the precise mechanism that allows decades of uninterrupted autobiographical recall remains incomplete. The third documented ability challenges one of our most basic assumptions about human perception, that vision is strictly dependent on eyesight. Human echolocation is a skill in which individuals, most commonly blind individuals, use reflected sound waves to perceive their surroundings. By producing sharp clicking sounds with the tongue, they generate acoustic pulses that bounce off nearby objects and return as subtle echoes. From these echoes, some individuals can determine the location, size, density, and even shape of obstacles in their environment. Laboratory tests have shown that trained echolocators can navigate complex obstacle courses, detect doorways, identify walls, and distinguish between different materials without sight. Functional MRI scans reveal something remarkable. When these individuals use echolocation, their visual cortex becomes active. In sighted individuals, the visual cortex processes optical input. In blind echolocators, that same region processes sound-derived spatial information. This demonstrates extreme neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to sensory deprivation. Science can explain how the brain adapts. It can measure cortical remapping. But what remains less understood is the upper limit of this adaptation. The fact that sound can substitute for vision at such a functional level suggests that perception itself may be far more flexible than traditionally assumed. Pain is designed to be unavoidable. It is the body's alarm system, immediate, overwhelming, and biologically essential. It protects tissue, prevents injury escalation, and forces behavioral correction. Yet there are documented individuals who exhibit extraordinary resistance to pain, far beyond typical thresholds measured in clinical settings. In controlled laboratory experiments, some subjects have tolerated ice immersion, electrical stimulation, and thermal exposure at intensities that would normally provoke rapid withdrawal. Researchers initially suspected high endorphin production, natural opioids released by the brain to dampen pain signals. However, in some cases, even when opioid-blocking drugs were administered, the resistance remained significantly elevated. Brain imaging studies reveal altered activity in regions associated with pain perception, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and insula. Rather than eliminating pain signals entirely, these individuals appear to process them differently, interpreting the sensation without triggering the typical emotional distress response. In rare genetic conditions such as congenital insensitivity to pain, individuals cannot feel pain at all. But this is dangerous and often life-threatening. The more intriguing cases involve individuals who can feel pain, but modulate their reaction to it voluntarily through training, meditation, or unknown mechanisms. Science understands fragments of this ability: neurological modulation, cognitive reframing, altered signal processing, but the full pathway allowing conscious override of pain intensity remains incompletely mapped. The fifth ability challenges our assumptions about intelligence itself. Savant-level calculation refers to individuals who can perform extraordinarily complex mathematical operations mentally, often in seconds, without formal training. Some can identify the day of the week for any given date across centuries. Others can extract cube roots of 6-digit numbers faster than most people can enter them into a calculator. In several documented cases, these abilities coexist with developmental conditions such as autism spectrum disorder. In others, they emerge following traumatic brain injury. Neurological studies suggest atypical connectivity patterns between hemispheres and altered activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and working memory. One prevailing theory proposes that savant abilities arise from reduced top-down filtering in the brain, granting access to raw computational processing typically inaccessible to conscious awareness. In most individuals, higher cognitive systems prioritize abstraction and generalization. Detailed low-level data is filtered out. In savants, that filtering mechanism may be diminished, allowing direct access to computational substructures normally operating below awareness. Yet this explanation does not fully account for the speed and scale of calculation observed in extreme cases. Brain scans show differences. Cognitive testing confirms extraordinary capacity. But science still cannot artificially induce this level of computational access in the average brain. The question remains open. Are these abilities rare anomalies or glimpses of latent cognitive potential within human neurology? Breathing is automatic. It is regulated by the brainstem, adjusting unconsciously to oxygen demand and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Most people can hold their breath for less than a minute before reflexive panic forces inhalation. Yet there are documented individuals who can hold their breath underwater for extended periods, far beyond what standard physiology predicts. In competitive freediving, breath hold times exceeding 8, 9, even 10 minutes have been recorded under controlled conditions. These feats are not achieved through supernatural tolerance. They involve measurable physiological adaptations, slowed heart rate, peripheral vasoconstriction, and optimized oxygen utilization. The mammalian dive reflex, normally triggered when the face contacts cold water, reduces heart rate and redirects blood toward vital organs. In trained individuals, this reflex appears amplified and consciously modulated. Blood chemistry tests reveal elevated tolerance to carbon dioxide buildup, delaying the urgent signal to breathe. Some studies suggest changes in spleen contraction, temporarily releasing additional oxygenated red blood cells into circulation. Science understands the components: oxygen storage, metabolic slowing, neural adaptation. But the degree of voluntary control over these systems remains unusual. The boundary between automatic survival reflex and conscious override becomes blurred, revealing a layer of physiological control few individuals ever access. The seventh ability does not involve strength, endurance, or memory. It involves perception itself. Synesthesia is a neurological condition in which stimulation of one sensory pathway automatically triggers experiences in another. For some individuals, numbers have colors, sounds produce visual shapes, words carry textures, musical notes evoke spatial patterns. These experiences are not metaphorical. Brain imaging confirms that when a synesthetic individual hears a tone, both auditory and visual regions of the cortex may activate simultaneously. Unlike hallucinations, synesthetic responses are consistent and repeatable. The color associated with the number 5, for example, does not change randomly over time. Neuroscientists propose that synesthesia results from increased cross-activation between adjacent brain regions that are normally more segregated. Another theory suggests reduced synaptic pruning during development, allowing additional neural connections to persist into adulthood. What remains unclear is why these cross-sensory links produce such stable and vivid perceptual experiences. Some synesthetes report enhanced memory performance, possibly due to multisensory encoding of information. Yet attempts to artificially induce synesthetic perception in non-synesthetic individuals have produced limited and inconsistent results. The phenomenon reveals that perception is not fixed. It is constructed, and in rare cases constructed differently enough to feel like a sensory superpower. The eighth and final ability involves one of the most fundamental human skills: recognizing faces. Most people can identify familiar faces quickly, but struggle with strangers, especially after time has passed. However, a small percentage of individuals, known as super recognizers, demonstrate facial memory far beyond the average range. In controlled tests, they can identify faces seen briefly years earlier, recognize individuals across drastic changes in age, hairstyle, lighting, or camera angle, and match blurred surveillance images to high-resolution photographs with unusual accuracy. This ability is not photographic memory in general. It is highly specific to facial processing. Neuroimaging studies suggest increased activity and structural differences in the fusiform face area, a region specialized for facial recognition. Some researchers propose that super recognizers possess enhanced holistic processing, meaning they encode the entire facial structure rather than isolated features. Unlike hyperthymesia, which centers on autobiographical memory, Superrecognition appears narrowly focused on visual identity. Interestingly, the opposite condition, prosopagnosia or face blindness, can result from damage to the same brain region, demonstrating how finely tuned this system is. Attempts to train average individuals to reach super-recognizer levels have yielded limited success. While improvement is possible, the extreme upper range appears rare and difficult to replicate. The existence of super-recognizers suggests that even within normal human biology, perception and memory operate across a spectrum far wider than we typically assume. These 8 abilities do not rewrite the laws of physics. They do not violate biology. Each one exists within measurable human systems: neurons, reflexes, metabolism, perception. And yet, in every case, something remains incomplete in our understanding. Science explains portions of these phenomena. Brain regions can be mapped, hormones can be measured, genetic variations can be identified, but explanation does not always equal replication. We cannot reliably induce hyperthymesia. We cannot manufacture savant calculation. We cannot universally train extreme cold resistance to the same degree. What these cases reveal is not that humans possess hidden mystical powers, but that the boundaries of human potential may be broader than standard models suggest. The extraordinary does not always lie outside biology. Sometimes it lies within it, waiting to be understood.